What appears at first glance to be the final farewell of a longtime Russian official may actually represent something far more significant. For decades, Sergei Ivanov stood among the small circle of individuals who helped shape modern Russia alongside Vladimir Putin, serving in some of the country's highest offices and earning a reputation as one of the Kremlin's most trusted figures. His passing is not simply the closing of an important political career. According to political analyst Vitaly Portnikov, it may also symbolize the beginning of an entirely new phase in Putin's leadership, one in which the generation that built today's Russian political system is gradually disappearing, leaving behind an increasingly centralized structure that depends more than ever on a single individual. Although Sergei Ivanov had largely stepped away from the public spotlight in recent years, his influence over Russian politics stretched back more than 2 decades. Throughout his career, he served as defense minister, first deputy prime minister, chief of the presidential administration, and a permanent member of Russia's Security Council until his removal in early 2026. These were not ceremonial appointments, but some of the most powerful positions within the Russian government, making Ivanov one of the few officials who remained consistently close to Vladimir Putin throughout much of his time in office. Watching the Russian president attend the farewell ceremony for one of his oldest political companions therefore carried symbolic importance that extended far beyond a traditional state event. It marked the first time that someone from Putin's original inner circle had reached the end of his journey, while Putin himself remained firmly in power, prompting many observers to wonder whether this moment signals the gradual passing of an entire political generation. Portnikov believes that this moment should be viewed not as an isolated event, but as the beginning of a broader transition that may unfold over the coming years. The officials who entered government alongside Putin during the late 1990s and early 2000s are now reaching an age where retirement, declining health, and the natural passage of time are becoming unavoidable realities. As those familiar faces gradually disappear, the Kremlin's leadership will inevitably change, not necessarily because of elections or political reform, but simply because history moves forward. For a political system that has relied heavily on long-standing personal relationships and loyalty built over decades, such changes may prove more significant than they first appear. To explain why Ivanov's passing carries such weight, Portnikov looks back to the earliest years of Putin's presidency, when critics often compared the new Russian leadership to the aging Soviet Politburo. At that time, a well-known satirical illustration portrayed Putin and his closest associates as elderly party officials, suggesting that they intended to remain in power indefinitely, much like the final generation of Soviet leaders. When the cartoon first appeared, many dismissed it as exaggerated political humor because Putin and those around him were still relatively young. Nevertheless, the image reflected growing concerns that political renewal had been replaced by an enduring concentration of power. More than 2 decades later, Portnikov argues that what once seemed like satire has evolved into something remarkably close to reality, as many of those same figures have remained central to Russian politics for an entire generation. Among that original group, Sergei Ivanov occupied a particularly unique position. His long career within the Soviet and later Russian security institutions established him as someone who shared not only Putin's professional background, but also many of his views regarding national security and the role of the Russian state. Their relationship was built over many years of cooperation rather than political convenience, leading many inside and outside Russia to view Ivanov as one of the few people capable of speaking to Putin as an equal. Unlike many later officials whose careers depended almost entirely on presidential approval, Ivanov had already earned considerable influence before reaching the highest offices in government, making him one of the Kremlin's most experienced and respected figures. At one point, his political future appeared even more remarkable, As Vladimir Putin approached the constitutional end of his second presidential term in 2008, discussions about who might succeed him became one of the most closely watched subjects in Russian politics. Several prominent names were mentioned, but Sergei Ivanov consistently appeared near the top of that list. Many analysts believe that his experience, security background, and close relationship with Putin made him an obvious candidate to assume the presidency while preserving continuity within the Russian government. Instead, Dmitry Medvedev ultimately received the position, allowing Putin to become prime minister before later returning to the presidency under arrangements that fundamentally reshaped Russia's political landscape. Portnikov believes that this decision deserves renewed attention because it represented one of the most important turning points in modern Russian history. Had Ivanov become president instead of Medvedev, the entire political trajectory of the country might have unfolded differently. Rather than attending the farewell ceremony of a former defense minister, Russia might today have been honoring the legacy of a former president whose leadership had defined an entirely separate era. Such a ceremony would undoubtedly have carried even greater historical significance, and the country's political institutions might have developed along a completely different path than the one ultimately chosen. The possibility becomes even more intriguing when considering Ivanov's personal character and reputation. Unlike Medvedev, who was widely viewed as a figure willing to preserve the existing balance of power, Ivanov had long been recognized as an independent and influential personality within Russia's governing establishment. His background in the security services, combined with years of administrative experience, suggested that he possessed both the confidence and institutional support necessary to exercise authority in his own right. Portnikov therefore raises the possibility that, had Ivanov become president, there would have been no guarantee that political power would eventually return to Putin in the same manner that it did after Medvedev's presidency. While no one can know with certainty how events would have unfolded, the very existence of that possibility highlights how different Russia's modern history might have been. This perspective also helps explain why Medvedev may have been viewed as the safer choice. During that period, influential political groups associated with former President Boris Yeltsin still retained considerable influence within Russia's governing elite. Balancing those competing interests required someone who appeared capable of maintaining stability without dramatically altering the existing political structure. Medvedev fit that description well, presenting himself as a consensus figure who could navigate different factions while allowing the broader system to remain intact until Putin's return. What followed, however, exceeded the expectations of many observers and fundamentally transformed the distribution of political power within the Russian state.